Hi, welcome to Ckiara Nation. Today we have Sasha Darling and my co-host Michael Ellsberg. Hey, Michael, introduce us to this wonderful, wonderful darling, Sasha.
Hi, everyone. Sasha, thank you so much for being here on Ckiara Nation. For those watching, I didn't know Sasha before, but I saw on Twitter that Sasha mentioned she's a sex worker and she used to be a SWERF, which is, for those watching, probably familiar with that term now, but it's sex worker exclusionary radical feminist, which is the term that sex workers and allies use to describe that wing of feminism, not all feminism, but the wing of feminism that is critical of sex workers and doesn't believe that sex workers should have rights. And so I was super intrigued, Sasha, because I had actually never heard it go that direction. You sometimes hear about former sex workers who become SWERFs, which actually I believe is part of your history, but you rarely hear about it go the other way. So we're really excited to hear your story. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Yeah, I was a cam girl. I kind of got sucked into the SWERF and TERF radical feminist movement, and then I later became de-radicalized and left and returned to sex work. I think it's something that a lot more sex workers kind of deal with, going through like a Jesus phase or a SWERF and TERF phase and then return. But I think very few of us speak out about it because it is kind of an embarrassing part of our personal histories.
Thank you. Yeah, and just so our viewers know, how would you describe the term TERF? What does that mean?
That a trans exclusionary radical feminist. So there is a lot of transphobia in radical feminist movements, and I don't mean like radical in the sense that some people do, but
Right.
like the specific subsection of, I guess, like first and second wave fem. TERF would be trans exclusionary radical feminists. They basically believe that trans women are really just men trying to infiltrate women's spaces, and it doesn't really hold up to like any scrutiny or scientific evidence at all.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And so why don't you just share whatever you feel comfortable sharing about the first part of your journey. You mentioned you were originally a sex worker or a cam performer. How did you get into that work originally?
Yeah, so growing up, I came from a pretty religious sort of household. I was definitely always kind of a rebellious kid. I ended up kind of getting into it with my parents in my teen years and moving out really young. Like, I think it was like on my 17th birthday. And at that time, I wasn't in communication with my parents. So I was going through a lot of just poverty, and I've kind of been very sex positive as like a rebellion for like the purity culture I sort of grew up in. And on like my 18th birthday, I started camming straight away, and just, was doing that for a while. I wasn't very good at it, but I jumped in, and it was more profitable than a lot of other options for like an 18-year-old with no life skills or anything. And I found it to be kind of fun in a lot of ways.
Do you have any shame behind it? What made you go into the whole SWERF thing? Did you develop a shame or some kind of
So when I was camming, hi, sorry, this is my cat. She
Hi.
decided to say hello.
What's your kitty's name?
Her name is Bean.
Bean. Hi, Bean.
Yeah, so I had been camming for, I think I only ended up camming for like a year, maybe a year and a half. And through camming, I got into, I don't know if there's a word for it necessarily, but I would do photo shoots with other people, and we would either like share the copyright for them so that we could both use them on our individual websites, or the person would pay me for like their private collection. And during this time, I ended up shooting with this person I had shot with a couple times before, And the one time that I went unchaperoned, this photographer ended up sexually assaulting me. I later found out that they were kind of blacklisted within other communities. And since they had moved to my city, not a lot of the models within there like knew about this. And I just felt really abandoned by the sex worker community. This was like 5 or 6 years ago. And I feel like there was definitely more of a mentality of like, when bad things happen, don't talk about it because it makes sex work as a whole look bad. We want to be portrayed as being like empowered and strong and like, like it's all sunshine and rainbows. And that's not the reality in any job, regardless of if it's sex work or not. And it's okay to acknowledge that. And I think now we definitely have more of a mentality. But at the time, I felt very alone. And so I had gone through this, like, honestly, pretty brutal assault. And I felt like no one was really listening to me. I felt like I was being silenced. And at this time, I was very active on Tumblr. And so I had seen sort of the radical feminist community because we were constantly at odds with them, the cam girl community and Surf and Turfs. We were, it was a online sort of war between us. And so I saw that a lot of them were women who had been sex work before and had left, and like this sort of support that they had with each other that I felt like I was really lacking. And so I kind of started like poking around these communities, and anytime I would interact with like a, swerf, there was this idea that they were like really mean and didn't care. But my experiences with them were that they were like, oh my God, yeah, like your abuse is valid, your experience is valid. And of this outpour of like support, and also this like oh, the industry's like that, and here, look at this thing that happened to this person and this other thing that happened to this person, and just like this constant inundation of trauma, a lot of people like to call it. Like, and I feel like camming is very limited experience when it comes to sex. So I'm hearing about all these other horrible things that are happening, and types of sex work that are way more I guess high risk would be a good way to describe it, than I was. And it was like, oh, like, maybe the Swerfs are right about all this other stuff too. And it's just like, you kind of get sucked in. And a lot of that is coming from trauma, I think, for most people in that movement, where it's like, we all just kind of feed off of each other's and like, validate it to the extent where it is unhealthy, and you're just living in it permanently and re-traumatizing yourself, which is a very effective sort of like brainwashing tactic for all sorts of groups.
That's what I was gonna ask. Was that the limit of their counseling for you?
Yeah, there was no real I mean, obviously they wanted, if you could, to see a therapist, and there was some like financial, like mutual aid going on, where if you were to say like, oh, I'm having trouble with my groceries, or like I need to afford therapy, they would like help you with that. And I was living in Memphis, Tennessee at the time, which is the South, so it wasn't sort of conservative views. But yeah, it was the extent of it was kind of like, it was more focused on hatred of men, hatred of, the industry, kind of an abstract concept to begin with, that focused on actual healing.
Okay.
It cut out for 1 second. I know I've heard this term used before in this discourse, but did you use the term trauma porn or something like that, or trauma? Yeah. So what, I think I have an idea of what that means, but what did that mean to you in your experience?
So the thing I could compare it to is like the anti-choice movement, and how they'll show you these pictures of dismembered babies, and like really try and use shock tactics to get you to have an emotional response. And you see the same thing in the radical feminist movement. You look at speakers like Gail Dines, for example, uses like really hardcore BDSM pornography lectures, without the consent of any of the performers involved. Right. Like, kind of, even if this was some performers felt exploited, do you really think that they want you to co-opt their trauma and use it for your message? You know what I mean? So they'll find like the most shocking sort of images or stories that they possibly can, and utilize that to further their message in a way that's like honestly really exploitative, but is very effective and emotionally like tugs at you.
So Sasha, what was your activity as a SWERF? Like what were you doing in terms of proactively furthering that set of politics?
So I wasn't in a town that was like big enough to have like protests or events or really anything like that. But I was definitely quite the keyboard warrior online in these groups, just like reading this sort of, or not retweeting, but like reblogging this propaganda and, reinforcing these sort of narratives. So I wasn't really involved in any sense of like actual like outdoor activism or like protests or debating people, but I was involved online quite a bit. Definitely a keyboard warrior, if you want to call it that. So I had my little blog that I've since taken down. I wish I could give you guys some examples, but I would just be, interacting with people, arguing with people on the internet, reinforcing these sort of narratives. And then, of course, like in my personal friend group in my real life, trying to convince people of my views, and just kind of like living in this echo chamber, essentially. I was online most of the time during this. And I was dealing with a lot of, PTSD from the assault. So I wasn't really like working. I was kind of being taken care of by my boyfriend at the time. Yeah, so in retrospect, I do more activism now than I ever did then. But I also think that just reinforcing these harmful narratives in itself is like so powerful.
Okay. Is this a regular practice on did you meet anyone else that was assaulted? And is this the regular practice?
I would say from my experience, and obviously this is anecdotal, about like 70% of the sex worker exclusionary radical feminists I met had been sexually assaulted. Like whether that be within the porn industry, some like really graphic, violent trauma that they had endured.
Mm-hmm.
I think a big part of the movement is just, I feel like when we're healing from trauma, we get to a point, and this is like kind of all of us, where we identify with the trauma and we have trouble separating our identity from what's happened to us.
Mm-hmm.
And and it's a normal part of the healing process.
Mm-hmm.
But the goal should always be to like kind of transcend that and find your identity outside of the trauma.
Exactly.
But in the TERF movement, in the SWERF and TERF movement, there's a lot of honing in and focusing on like, you are your trauma, and validating it to an extent where like it kind of transcends validating it, and it's just who you are. It's become like, your identity, in this really unhealthy, toxic way.
Very. Not only that, but you give a lot of power to your abuser. He's taken over,
and
he or she has taken over your life, and that
absolutely.
It's very unhealthy.
And in a way, it takes the blame off of your abuser too, if you're like
Mm-hmm.
a woman who was in the sex industry, because their narrative is, the sex industry is dangerous, the industry did this to you, which takes the blame off of the person who actually raped you.
Exactly.
Yes.
And that's really messed up.
That is such an important point. Thank you for that, because in my extensive reading of SWERFs, I spent a lot of time reading their stuff. I get this subtle sense that in a way there's actually almost this subtle, they don't mean it this way, but it almost comes across as this subtle victim blaming, where when you have this really rigid, dogmatic view of like, there's no way the sex industry could be safe, it's all rape, it's all abuse, then when someone's like, well, I went in voluntarily, I went in voluntarily, I went in willingly, they're kind of almost like, well, what did you expect? And that's what police officers say too. So there's this weird synergy between the stereotypes that police officers have. They're like, well, you were selling sex, what do you expect? And then the SWERFs are like, well, you were selling sex, what do you expect? And it's like like you said, letting the perpetrators off the hook, because they're just viewed as this monolithic industry rather than individuals who commit crime and violation.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of parallels to religious conservatism too, which is like really kind of ironic during most like radical are very like pro-choice and like see religion as sometimes another arm of patriarchy. But then when it comes to achieving the mutual goal of, you know, harming sex workers or, you know, the sex work abolitionist movement, they're more than willing to ally with religious groups.
Yeah,
that's to push their agenda, and that's
Yeah.
a problem with SWRFs, I believe. I wanted to ask you another question. What purpose did you see any good? Did you get any good out of the SWRF?
Yeah. Um, so for me, for to being in the SWRF and TERF community, I was really into this liberal pop feminism, which I also kind of disagree with in a lot of ways. A lot of people would refer to it as, you know, white feminism, where there's not a lot of intersectionality. It's just kind of like, oh, you know, I don't like being catcalled and like, you know, girl power, but like there's no actual like substance to it. And so I feel like for me, I really just went from one extreme to another extreme. And I think kind of like going through both of those, like I've always been sort of an extremist, like the type of person who wants to see like how far I can go or is really good at like taking one side or the other. And I think coming out of the SWRF and TERF radical feminism movement taught me a lot about balance. You know, like it's okay to ask difficult questions sometimes, and it's okay to, you know, be more critical of certain things. But there's always should be a balance. It shouldn't just be like 100% one way or 100% the other, and to like, you know, be more of a critical thinker, I guess, you know?
Mm. That's a strong label. You would characterize the SWRF and TERF as a hate group.
Absolutely. I don't like, and here's my reasoning is that like, I don't think any hate group self-identifies as a hate group. I don't think anyone's the villain narrative. I'm really into like political theory. And so I watch a lot of debates between like, you know, radical leftist communists, like, you know, unironic pro-fascists, and no one's the villain in their own narrative ever. People are there in the right. Nobody's like actively trying to hurt other people. And that's just human nature, you know? And so I think in a way, having been in that movement and looking back on it, it's easier for me to argue points more empathically and effectively without getting too upset at people, you know, and just looking at radical beliefs and looking at people with a sense of, or looking at arguments with a sense of empathy. Instead of just getting up and heated and being like, well, this person is just a hateful bigot. And it's kind of like, you can be bigoted and you can be hateful and still not be like consciously aware that that's what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. So tell us about your journey now, kind of getting out of that world. Oh, one question. So I assume you were, at that period, you had taken a break from sex work. You were not doing sex work? Yeah.
So during this time when I was active, which was probably like, all of this happened very quickly. It was probably like a year and a half. And then of course, becoming de-radicalized, it was very slow. It was like kind of one step at a time with things and challenging my own ideas because, you know, that community is so insulated, and there's not a lot of room for, you know, challenging these ideas or anything without being shouted down. And potentially losing the support that got you into the movement to begin with. But yeah, a lot of what got out of it was just like not being insulated on the internet anymore. And so I compare it to like another comparison to hate groups there would be that like oftentimes it's like go out in the real world, you start realizing that maybe you're wrong.
Yeah.
So I started you know, working at like an IHOP or something, and like another thing I wanted to mention is no one ever talks about the privilege of leaving sex work. You have to be sort of a privileged position to be able to exit when you want. And the swerve and turf movement doesn't really talk about that often. I mean, they kind of do in the narrative of like rescuing people, but the voices that they prop up of people who are like, oh, I was so hurt in this industry, and then I left. And it's kind of like, well, how'd you figure out how to leave, you know? And oftentimes they're women without children, that, you know, oftentimes white, which does grant you a lot of privilege and, you know, like opens a lot of doors for you. Oftentimes they talk these narratives of like, oh, I was a high class call girl or whatever, and it was still horrible for me. And it's kind of like, you never hear like, oh, I was stuck in the sex industry and these wonderful radical feminists like helped lift me out of it, being respectful about what I was and wasn't comfortable with coming out about, and, you know, helped me get to a point where I was safely able to exit. Like, it's never like that. Like,
Okay, well, I've known many of people who have exited, and regardless of color, regardless of of status, when you don't want something, you just leave. And even women I've known, and I wish I could get her on the show. She left not because something bad happened to her or anything.
Yeah.
She just didn't want her daughters in the adult industry, so she wanted to lead by example, and she just left. She had 5 girls, and she was a brown person, and she just left, and she just struggled for a bit and furthered her education, but that's because she had that will. And
Absolutely.
it's about the will of the human being, not necessarily anything else.
Oh, for sure. But what I mean is there's always this demand from sex worker exclusionary radical feminists that like, oh, if you want to leave, just leave right now. And for a lot of people, they don't have that option. It's like, okay, well, you know, I'm going to make an exit plan. It's going to take me a couple months to get out, you know?
Okay, yeah.
And there was never that sort of, grace given to them. It was always like, no, we need to get you out like right this second. And it's kind of like, I know a lot of people who have left too, and most of them, it isn't like they wake up one day and just decide not to be a sex worker anymore. It's kind of like, oh, well, let me save up like $500 or whatever, and then I'll like go and get another job and we'll figure it out that way. There's no like gradual forgiveness in that movement for that.
Okay, do the SWERFs offer you something? Do they offer you room and board?
The rescue groups definitely do, and a lot of SWERFs will like point you towards those and be like, oh, well, here's this organization or that organization, and you know, they'll do that. But also like when I left sex work, I was given a lot of like, you know, oh, like I, you know, would put out, oh, I'm trying to leave sex work and I need money for groceries. Like, is anyone willing to help out? And there was a ton of mutual aid in that group. Like, there was a ton of people like willing to like, you know, help each other out and give each other money. It wasn't necessarily a financial incentive so much as it was just part of the support that you would receive within that group.
Okay. But they really don't offer, do they offer any type of job training or
No.
Let's say it was a serious thing, because they might serve a purpose if they did it with a lot of consciousness and a lot of mindfulness. If they actually did it without trying to
they would
without putting someone down to try to make themselves look good. You know what I'm saying? So
they would
if there was something really bad, like let's say an actual traffic person, what were they offering them? What do they offer them? Housing and training and education? And is there a plan made for them, or is it just brainwashing?
I never really heard a lot about other like groups that would help people out of the industry unless it was, you know, being pointed towards like you know, rescue groups. Oftentimes like Pink Cross was one that came up, and they were very religious, and there's a lot of scandals within them too, unfortunately. And so like oftentimes other rad femmes would point towards these groups, but they were usually like rescue groups, which is like a whole industry in its own. I, now know with a lot of these rescue groups, they're headed by like Christian, straight white dudes who have no fucking concept of what it is you would be going through. They're often very like dehumanizing towards sex work, where they'll tell you like, oh, you did it because you have low self-esteem, or like you don't love yourself and that's why you were involved in this. And when it comes to like human trafficking, the majority of people who are being trafficked are migrants and people who, are undocumented. So if they go to these groups, oftentimes those groups will just turn them over to Homeland Security or people who will deport them if they want to seek justice for their trafficker.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a deterrent right there. I mean, what purpose are they? What purpose are they even serving?
There's a really great video by Oliver Thorne. He runs a YouTube channel called Philosophy Tube, and he makes the argument that the sex worker abolitionist group isn't so much about getting rid of sex work as it is making sex workers disappear. So if you can't see the problem, then you can pretend that it doesn't exist. Yeah,
that tracks to my understanding of what they're up to. Is they really hate that this industry exists, and it goes beyond their appropriate upset for the dark side of the industry, which everybody admits or should admit exists.
Absolutely.
But it goes beyond that, and they really say like it's inherently wrong. The industry is inherently violent. It's inherently degrading. It inherently contributes to wider violence against women. We must get rid of the whole thing. They know they can't actually get rid of it, so they just want to sweep it under the rug as much as possible. Yeah. And another, go ahead.
There's a lot of cognitive dissonance there, and like you look at, we don't treat any other industry that features a lot of violence like that. Like you look at the agriculture industry, for example, the highest rates of human trafficking among any industry, but no one's out here saying we need to ban vegetables, because that's just not realistic. And like there are always going to be, corporations that are shady and maybe exploit labor. And there's always going to be people who, feel the need to work in those industries. Wouldn't be so much more productive to, grant those people rights, give them the ability to unionize, help them kind of like reduce harm in those industries rather than just, get rid of the industry as a whole or pretend that it doesn't exist.
Coming from a religious background, does any of this still clash? Do you sometimes sit down and be like, is this God? Is God punishing me? Or you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I think we all deal with internalized sort of beliefs of anything that's kind of been put on us, where occasionally you'll sit and you'll ponder, but for me, I think looking back, it's like my mom went through a lot of trauma growing up. And so looking back for my mom, I can clearly see why she got into religious fundamentalism. And a big part of it was because she experienced trauma when she was growing up. And it was a way for her to feel safe, to feel like she was protecting herself, to kind of reclaim a part of herself that maybe she felt like trauma had taken from her. And in retrospect, that's exactly the same thing that I was doing with, the sex worker exclusionary movement, is I was like, oh, well, if I switch to this side of looking at things, then in my head, I can kind of rationalize what it is that happened to me and feel like I'm fighting back against it. And it was just because it wasn't like a religious narrative doesn't mean that it wasn't the exact same sort of concept. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So it's like that, what is it? The cliche, we all become our parents. Definitely very true.
Yeah. Now, when we were originally talking ahead of this interview, you mentioned that there was a period during the SWERF time when you still found yourself having, kinks and like having kinky desires and maybe looking at some forms of porn. And then there was like an inner kind of turmoil around that split between your desires and your political views.
Absolutely. It's funny because like I was not engaging in fetish sort of like activity when I was going through this phase and in like the rad femme movement. And I assumed like, because the narrative in like the rad femme movement is like, oh, like, you know, any kink that features like themes of, you know, maybe violence or power exchanges inherently is bad and contributes to violence against women, you know. And so it was something where I was kind of iffy about it first, but I was like, oh, like, you know, maybe they're right because they were right about the porn industry, you know. And so it was this thing where I felt like, oh, well, you know, I'm going to stop participating in fetish activities and, you know, see if that helps me heal from this trauma, because they were saying that participating in like BDSM or fetish desires was re-traumatizing yourself, and it would make you trauma bond to your partner and all this stuff that like scientifically there's no evidence for. And so I, you know, wasn't actively participating in like fetish activity, but the desires never went away. Like I didn't feel any better. I didn't feel like, you know, like I'm kind of glad that I took a break from it, because it did prove to me that like nothing about participating in fetish for me was inherently like self-harm or like hurting me in any way. And I think that was like a valuable experience, just to like take a break and see how, you know, my relationship with fetish and with kink was. But it was like I was still having these thoughts. So I would, you know, like when I would masturbate or, you know, be like having sex with my boyfriend, I would be picturing these things, and I would just, instead of accepting that as like a normal part of my sexuality, I would just feel this immense amount of guilt, which was actively more harmful than just allowing myself to have consensual experiences and play with those themes and fantasies.
Yeah, I understand completely. My mom's a reverend. I always bring her up, but it's true, because when I masturbated, it would be so good the whole coming, and then afterward the guilt of playing with myself. So terrible.
I relate.
Yeah.
I relate. No, I grew up in the purity culture, and I feel that so hard.
Right.
It was the same feeling. It's like when I was like a little kid, and I wouldn't like, because I have OCD, and when I was growing up, a lot of it was very religious in nature. So it would be like this obsessive, like praying and like, you know, oh, like I haven't repented for them, and if I die tomorrow, I'll go to hell, and like ruminating on those thoughts, and like sexuality being a big part of that, and being like, oh, am I like doing something wrong? Like what's wrong with me? And then like a lot of, I think fetish for me was very healing, because I have a huge blasphemy kink now. And, like,
oh wow!
That's my way of reclaiming, you know, my like all this guilt and these feelings and processing it. And I think it's very healthy, and my therapist says it's very healthy too. So,
oh, girl.
Wow. Wow. Amazing. Yeah, to me, I find it very interesting the way that swerfism can often recreate a lot of the religious shaming of sex without an overtly religious exterior. So patriarchy for thousands of years has told people, especially women, you know, don't be sexual in X, Y, and Z ways. Actually, A to Z ways, pretty much, except for procreative sex. And so there's all this, as you said, all this guilt. And then,
or this like weird wholesome lesbian sex idea that they have.
Right.
But it's crazy because I have a female partner as well, and we have like super kinky sex, and the patriarchy is not involved at all, I promise.
Totally. And that was actually one of the original splits in the sex wars. It started in the late 70s and early 80s. It wasn't actually between swerfs and men. It was between swerfs and lesbians who were into S&M. And the swerfs were like, you're recreating the patriarchy. This is wrong. And so it's like instead of throwing off these chains of like, fuck anybody who tells me about my body and my sexuality, it's just taking the religious chains off and putting on this whole other set of chains. Like, oh, you cannot have sex unless it's you know, perfectly aligned with our ideology of,
Yeah.
you know, anti-male dominance kind of thing.
Yeah, well, it's evident. I mean, now that we have information and everything, it's so evident that it was just a male way of controlling the female, because overall a pussy can cause wars. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? And
Someone
and,
to Troy, I feel you.
they just didn't want us to know the power of the pussy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's basically.
Absolutely. Also in these movements, they totally ignore female domination. And
Exactly.
like they like pretend that like that side of fetish doesn't exist, and it's always this like male dominant thing. They also ignore male sex workers, even though like from my experiences within the LGBT community, there are a ton of gay male sex workers out there, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And like, do they not, like, if the goal is to like help people and this is such an exploitative industry, why are we only focusing on like one aspect of it, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, and you mentioned also at this time you were looking at porn, and you kind of had a inner conflict around that.
Occasionally I would cave and look at porn. For the most part I didn't. I've always been like more imaginative than anything else, but occasionally I would, because like you would, especially like a big part, and this is like difficult to explain to someone who probably like hasn't like been in the movement, but like you would see a lot of porn just with rad femmes pointing out how awful it is.
Mm-hmm.
And so you would see it, I would see like, you know, this like terrible, like, oh, this woman like being abused, like a video of like Sasha Grey licking a toilet or something, which like, as we know, especially in her instance, she doesn't feel bad about any of that. She's said multiple times, even now that she's exited the industry, she's like, I was experimenting with my sexuality and I loved it, you know? So you would see like these like videos or pictures of women being like absolutely like brutalized, and it was supposed to be like shocking and like to make you feel like you know, like this was some horrible thing. And I would see it and I'd be like, I don't know, man, like that's kind of hot. Like have this like physical response to it, and like just feel, and like it would pop up in my mind when I was like trying to achieve orgasm later, and I would just like feel this immense amount of guilt where it's like, oh my god, I'm getting off on like, you know, this person being like brutalized, and like in reality probably not.
They're
I mean,
enjoying. Yeah, they're enjoying it.
yeah, like so for sure in some instances, but like maybe the person was being abused, like violence does happen in this industry, but like mostly it was just like shocking BDSM porn, and that was what they were trying to get you to like realize was bad. But I don't know, like at some point you got to be like, man, like as a rad femme, I'm definitely looking at way more porn than I ever looked at when I wasn't. Like,
yeah, that reminds me. So I didn't realize this, but in all the big federal obscenity cases, the famous ones that went to the Supreme Court, they actually often played the films that were at issue in the Supreme Court. So you have basically like, you know, these highest legal minds in the country watching hardcore porn
and getting a boner.
Yeah, and there's definitely totally, and no, there's definitely like in the jury selection, there have been instances where jury members have admitted that they were like kind of getting off on what they were watching in there.
Oh, it's the absolute same thing today, where you see all these politicians rallying against sex work and like saying that, you know, like we have like FOSTA and SESTA and passing laws like that, and you know for a fact that they have their like courtesans behind the scenes and their mistresses and their sex workers that they employ and are like using the labor of and enjoying the labor of.
So Sasha, tell us now about your process of leaving the SWERF movement and reintegrating back into sex work and into sex worker politics.
So I left this movement when I was like 19, about to turn 20 or so, you know, or I rather like re-entered the real world, where I was 19 and I got this job at IHOP and I was kind of working there, and I still held on to a lot of these beliefs, but I was making friends in real life and not just, you know, sitting at home depressed on my computer all day, every day. And I was slowly kind of like meeting people who were, you know, trans or new trans people, or like, you know, people who like kind of challenged my ideas. And I think a lot of that was growing up in the South. People are much more forgiving of like problematic ideas because it's the South and everybody's like, you're surrounded by people who are like way worse, you know? And so I would like be exchanging ideas with people, and they would be like, oh, but like, you know, really think about that. Like, you know, like, and kind of deconstructing my beliefs in like a kind way, which like, in retrospect, I'm kind of like, man, like, I wish I could go back in time and punch myself. I don't know how anybody dealt with me. But just like being in the real world and like being kind of like, you know, like maybe porn's not really a big deal, you know, and like being like, well, I stopped participating in kink for a few years, and I, you know, really don't think it improved my mental state that much. So when I was actively participating in it, and I was working at this bar, and I had like known trans people, and I was still kind of like I don't know, but I ended up moving in with a like non-binary person and being like, yo, so like I used to be like really turfy, and like I still have all these questions about it that like I'm having trouble answering, you know what I mean? So like obviously like I had gotten to the point by then where I was like, trans people, you know, are just trying to live their lives. Obviously no one's gonna go through like that big of a change just, you know, fucking because you know.
Sad.
Yeah, like it's traumatic. Like no one's gonna like be like, oh well, I decided to change my gender and like I'm gonna cause this huge rift in my life between my friends and family and ability to get employed, you know, like for no reason. But I was still kind of like, well, like, you know, what's the difference between, you know, being trans and like what does it mean to like feel like a woman, and all these sort of like questions and stuff, and just like having those questions answered genuinely instead of it being looked at as like, oh, the question in itself is problematic, which I think is a big problem in a lot of these communities, is like we have to have room to ask difficult questions and answer them.
Thank you. Thank
And a
you.
lot of
That
people,
is a
yeah.
big problem. I feel that that is the problem with political correctness. It goes too far, and people can't. Well, basically, we're lying to each other because we are not being absolutely honest with our questions or how we feel. And
Yeah.
when you do that, it's unhealthy, and
I
and
agree.
it makes you kind of weak, because if you're that touchy, it's like, why, you might as well be in a shelter by yourself inside a hole or something,
And
because everyone has that right to have that freedom of expression, you know.
yeah. And I agree that there's like, obviously there are trolls. There are people who are going to like ask you questions in bad faith that don't really care about your answer, that are just trying to get a gotcha. And in that instance, like, no, don't respond, don't deal with it, you know? But if somebody's coming to you and they're like legitimately wondering and questioning and they don't understand something, like, point them in the right direction at least, you know, like, no, it's not your job to educate other people, but it's really not that hard to just drop a link and be like, oh, well, here's a book I read that like really helped me understand this, or like, here's this article that I read that like I agree with, and just like send that person on the right track, you know. And that's something I think is really important, because it's, you know, it's easy to, especially online, just assume that everyone's being a troll or like, you know, trying to argue with you. But in real life, a lot of people, I think, are just asking questions, and they haven't been exposed to the information that you've been exposed to. And that's important to keep in mind.
Okay, as I wanted to ask you a question, since we're on that note, and you being in the sex industry, is it purely more money, or is there a sort of passion or a sort of love involved? Is it a labor of love, or is it a labor of money? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't think with any job it's 100% one way or the other for anybody. And I think that everyone's relationship with their labor is going to be different. Like, I know people in the sex industry where it's purely money, it's the best job for them, they don't necessarily like it, but they're okay with it because, you know, it's getting them where they need to go. And I know people who like had everything they could possibly want and still chose sex work. And for me, it's somewhere in between, you know, like I've dabbled in like full service, I've done like fetish work and stuff. You know, still do fetish work occasionally here and there. I like right now I mostly just cam and I strip. And for me, there are days where I genuinely love my job, where I feel on top of the world, where I like record a really good video and I'm like feel very artistic when I'm making it, and the, you know, outfits that I'm dressing up in like make me feel very powerful, and like I feel like I'm creating art more than I'm making like porn, which I don't think that they necessarily have to be different things. Or with like stripping, where like I get on stage and I like kill it, and I'm like just really good at my pole work, and like I love being up there and, you know, dancing and performing. And then there are days where I'm just having a bad day, and like I, you know, don't necessarily want to make a video and I don't want to give a lap dance, but, you know, it's, for me, it never feels any different than when I was working in a bar and I was having a bad day or a good day. Except the difference is like within sex work, I have way more agency. I'm able to say no to people. I'm able to tell people they're being assholes if they're being assholes, you know? I don't have to beg for a tip. I can just be like, well, I'm not going to deal with you anymore. Bye, you know?
Exactly.
I'm able to work on my schedule when I want to. I'm not beholden to anyone. I don't have to give away like most of my money to somebody else. I'm not making someone else richer. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like that agency, I don't think sex work has to be empowering to be valid, but I think that being financially stable in itself is, and having agency in itself is empowering. And if you can find that in another job, that's great. I found it in sex work, you know?
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And you mentioned when we were originally talking, Sasha, that there obviously, you know, it's financial, it's work, but there also was some idealism in your case, in the sense of providing touch to people.
Yeah.
We're in a touch-starved society. What's your sense of the clients? Because obviously, you know, the SWERFs completely demonize clients. A lot of sex workers, and this is completely their prerogative, but I've definitely heard sex workers who are like, I hate my clients, but it's still a job and I deserve rights, which I totally validate that perspective. You know, what is your perspective on clients?
I mean, I think everybody's going to have a different relationship with their clients, like you said. For me personally, especially when I was like dabbling in full service and stuff, I do believe we lived in a touch-starved society. And one of the ways that like patriarchal structures backfire on men is that a lot of the times you guys don't get physical touch unless you're in a romantic relationship. Like as a woman, when I'm with my female friends, we can braid each other's hair, we can cuddle, you know, like we can hug each other, give each other a kiss on the cheek. And like with men, there's definitely like a barrier there where it's, you know, there's like a no homo sort of culture. Even if you're not, you know, homophobic, it's like you're not getting physical contact or physical connection with another human being unless it's within the context of sex and sexuality. And so I think for a lot of men, when it comes to like whether you are paying for time with an escort or you're getting a lap dance, it's kind of just dressed up in sex. It's really more about just feeling heard and feeling the touch of another human being and like a human connection. And like that makes me, when I work, feel like I'm providing a service that's more than just some superficial sort of, you know, thing. And even when it is just a superficial, like, oh, I'm drunk, like, let me have this hot chick grind on me, that's fine too. That's totally okay. I'm more than fine with providing that service, you know?
Bravo. Yes.
And so, and one question, and yet, first of all, you nailed it on that, you hit the nail on the head there with homophobia leading to men not really experiencing or knowing how to experience touch, or even a lot of emotional intimacy unless it's in a sexual context. And so if you have a guy who doesn't know how to have a girlfriend or can't get a girlfriend or is socially awkward in that way, plus that homophobic training, you have a guy who is desperate for touch.
Or men who just don't have time, you know, maybe you're a lawyer and you don't have like, you know, your focus is on your career and you're not able to provide the emotional element of a relationship to someone else right then and there. Like, you know, it's fine to go and seek out your needs to be like heard and experience connection without, you know, bringing someone else into it that may not get, you know, a fair like amount of the relationship.
Yeah.
I
And
think, and
just one more on this is, you know, in terms of like what each side is getting in the exchange, you had mentioned to me also that you felt before you were a sex worker that you were, and I've heard other sex workers mention this, that you were actually kind of giving sexual attention away and not really getting that much in return.
Yeah.
Kind of and sex work was a way that you were able to get value for what you had been giving away for free. Like, tell us about that.
I feel like all sex is transactional, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that because you obviously wouldn't have sex with someone, you know, without currency if you weren't enjoying it, you know. But even in the context of like a monogamous relationship, you'll hear couples all the time be like, oh, like, you know, we're going to go to this really boring family event, but I'll give you a blowjob when we get home, you know, like if you just suffer through this with me. And that's transactional, and that's okay. And like, even if the only thing that you desire out of a sexual experience is pleasure, that's still, you know, a term of consent. And so the way I look at it a lot of time in sex work is like, my terms of consent are just different than what other people's would be. So like maybe my term of consent isn't pleasure, my term of consent is a set price. And so if that term of consent is broken, I still feel violated. But if that term of consent is adhered to, I don't feel violated, you know? And yeah, like when I was younger, it was like, I definitely in my head didn't think that I was, you know, exchanging sex for favors. But like as like a teenager, I would definitely like sleep around a little bit, or like, you know, hang out with dude and have like sort of a fuck buddy relationship with someone. And I knew that it was more so about like either the attention that I was getting, or you know, just because this person was giving me rides and giving me a lot of like attention or material goods and stuff. And so when I started doing full service work, it was like, oh, I could have just been charging what I feel I deserved the whole time without playing games, you know? Like it was like something I had done 100 times before, but just had done wrong, you know?
yeah, without the headache, it's basically without the headache. And because sex has such a stigma, and it's been a stigma for centuries, and because most of the rules that we abide by and our morals are based on biblical, that's the Bible manipulated by a man or men, we don't we have these issues that are telling us that to feel guilty, to feel shame, that we don't really need this, that all we need is Jesus, or all we need is Buddha or whoever else. Because and I've noticed in every major religion right now in this century, everyone avoids sex, even in the self-help books with self-help gurus and so forth, because I use that a lot back in the past. I noticed that sex is such a taboo that it's never mentioned, and when it is mentioned, it's never in the contents of recreation. It's always in the contents of marriage, or something clinical, or someone speaking on it on a clinical basis. It's never about the individual. And like Susan Wright, who we just recently interviewed, she says sex is like a thumbprint, and it differs from person to person.
The way anyone wants to experience sex is valid. I think a big thing with like the religious and self-help connotation is a lot of so for me personally, I am really into philosophy. I really like absurdism, and Albert Camus is like one of my favorite philosophers. And I feel like a lot of happiness derives in setting goals and teaching yourself discipline. And I think that the easy way into teaching yourself discipline and the obvious thing is sex. So it's easy to latch onto that and be like, oh, well, like we can establish discipline in this area. And then also just like the connotations that sex has with like power. obviously, and like we were talking about patriarchy earlier with like, you know, major religions, or at least like the Abrahamic ones, it was like, this is something to be feared. Like personal power is like something you should reject and fear, and individuality is something you should reject and fear, and sex is so individual, and so powerful. But it's only as powerful as the power we give it, I feel like. I think if we lived in a society where we were more like, you know, sex is individual from person to person, and it's totally fine, and like, you know, however you want to use it or do it is up to you as an individual, how you consent, then it wouldn't have the amount of power it has now, which like as a sex worker probably would be a bad thing for me. I wouldn't make as much money if people were sexually liberated.
I know.
But
Well, I think you could still make money at it. It's just you would take out a lot of the badness out of it.
yes,
That's what we're going for. And yeah, and that's the whole point of this show, is to help bring that kind of social change around sexuality, sex workers, and so forth. If it wasn't such a big thing, like people's children being taken away from them, you know, it really goes real deep. I mean, you're single, but people's children get taken away from them. They destroy families. They destroy a human being. I knew this one sex worker. I mean, she was great. She was wonderful. She had her son, and you know, I went through my own little thing, but I saw her one time, and then she told me they had taken her kid. She was great. She had everything. She was right, disciplined, on the money.
yeah,
And in a matter of about 5 months, I see her as a beggar on the street, and that shit hurt me so bad because she was so strong and so wonderful. And it's her kids that made her that, and she really loved what she was doing because that's what brought us together as friends, because you know, because we connected, because we both love sex work, even the cons. So but to watch her deteriorate the way she deteriorated to this day, she's still like a beggar on the street. I saw her daughter the other day, and she was begging her. She said, "Mom, stop drinking for me." I saw the whole thing, and even right to this, in this 2020, and this happened like 12 years ago. Yeah, it's the reason why this show was created, because those type of things have to be stopped, and it doesn't matter if sex workers won't be as popular because it's not as taboo, but families will still be together, and women will be able to hold their heads up and not have to hide or have, you know, those type of situations happen, because there's a lot of good mothers in most shows on television. And oh, sorry. I'm sorry, audience, I'm still getting used to this.
you're good.
In most media, there, the only thing they will depict is when you have a criminal and so forth. They'll depict that his mother was a prostitute or something, or her mother was a prostitute or something.
No, the way we're depicted in media is like so offensive. It's really difficult, I think. Like even for me, sometimes I'll be watching a show and I'll see them use sex workers as a plot point in this like really negative light, and that like makes me so upset. Because I know so many more sex workers who are powerful women, who are mothers, you know, who like are like, and I know a lot of women who are single mothers who are sex workers, and that's the job that lets them spend the most time with their children, that lets them provide their children with everything that they need, that allows them to be the super moms that they are without having to have 4 jobs and never see their kids. And I also, you know, like you said, with women losing custody of their children within sex work, coming from the South, I know a couple of women who were dancers that lost custody, and that was brought up, and one of the reasons that their, you know, ex-partner or their parents were able to fight and win custody of their children, which is horrible, because that has nothing to do with their ability to be a mom. You know, you're not bringing the kids to the club with you. You know?
and also stripping is legal. Not that it's okay not that it's okay to, you know, take kids away from sex workers in criminalized sectors of the industry, but this is a case where it happens to porn performers and strippers. So you're saying it is not okay to be a mom and to engage in this perfectly legal industry that millions of people are customers of, that probably your friends are customers of, but if you're the provider of it, that's shameful and you can't be a good parent.
I think
that's
a lot
so
of it
messed up.
I think a lot of it comes down to these toxic concepts of womanhood and the idea that, like, I mean, it's the same as like what rad femmes say they're fighting against. We're like, oh, women should be meek and submissive. And it's like the idea of like a woman's sexuality should be, you know, within these very strict confines. And if you aren't willing to adhere to these sexual rules, then like you don't get to experience womanhood in these other ways. And like, it's just bizarre and archaic and arbitrary.
Yeah, but who are you to say that? And you know, especially these religious people, it's just like how judge not lest ye be judged. There's so many Bible breaking you're doing.
Absolutely. Jesus was so pro sex work. He hung out with Mary Magdalene. Nowhere in the Bible does it say she stopped.
And they were probably having a good time because he was a physical human being.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's one of my favorite lines in all of Western literature. William Blake in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell says, "Brothels are built with the bricks of religion," and that just like, to me, that just nails it, because it's like, if you didn't have this religious shaming of sex, and everybody just felt free to express their sexuality with whoever they wanted without all these strictures, you probably wouldn't have an industry that catered to, or you'd have much less of an industry that catered to people who are literally starving for touch.
Absolutely. The history of temple prostitution is really interesting too, in that like we look at the narrative of like ancient Mesopotamian prostitution, where it was like these women were revered as priestesses, as like spiritual guides, as like, you know, they didn't just provide sexual services. It was like talk therapy and massage and couples therapy and fertility spells and all this other stuff, to now where we look at, you know, like society as a whole rather looks at sex workers as like a last resort, like completely like unenlightened, horrible thing. And it just goes to show that like the context and the narrative that society has is like, that's what's framing sex work. It's not the work itself that makes it good or bad.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. What?
I just looked down on my floor, and then I was looking at her painting, and there's a dildo on my floor. You see it right? And then I'm looking.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah, me and my boyfriend commissioned this painting from a really good artist named Boudouin Art as like an anniversary gift to each other. It was like from a still of one of our videos that we made.
I love it.
It's hot.
Thank you. One of my favorite possessions.
I've just a couple more questions. Sasha, what is your best understanding? Because I don't understand this fully, as to why, if you take a Venn diagram of swerfs and turfs, it's almost a circle. There's very few swerfs who aren't turfs. There's a few, but very few. And there's very few turfs who aren't swerfs. Why this correlation? Why are these two go together so strongly?
I think it's because it's like kind of this cult mentality, and it goes with like any other sort of cult, where it's like you get into it because of these one or two things, but the echo chamber and the demand of like how you behave and what you believe is so strong that the other stuff just kind of comes with it. So like you join this group and you're like, you know, like I agree with this stuff, but I'm unsure about this stuff. And it's kind of, I think, some of the same reason that like the, you know, like you could make a good example with like neo-Nazis is like they'll accept anything, you know what I mean? They're so desperate for members that it's like if you agree with one part of their ideology, they will not challenge you on anything else. And that support is intoxicating. Having someone just blindly agree with you is intoxicating. And so when people disagree with you from the group after like love bombing you and giving you so much support, you kind of like, you want to please them. Like you want to keep getting that immense amount of support and like love, or what you perceive to be love, because it's, you know, conditional, that you just end up kind of like doing the work to make it make sense. You know what I mean? And then there's a lot of like just misrepresentation of data and statistics that TERFs will utilize to make their points seem very accurate. And like there's this kind of conspiracy theory that anything you disagree with is like or anything that disagrees with their line of thought is like obviously has some like insidious motive behind it, when in reality oftentimes the data that like they use is like coming from like right-wing Christian groups with like a pool of only like 3 or 4 people that they're studying, and like heavily manipulated data. And it's like kind of this rejection of critical thinking where you just slowly start to be like, well, I guess I hate trans people now, you know?
Yeah.
But they would never say they hate trans people. It's always within the context of like, oh, we're trying to help them, just how they talk about sex workers.
Yeah. Love the, what is it? Love the sin, hate the sin, love the sinner. That's kind of the same thing.
It's exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
It's so dogmatic.
Yeah. Well, now that's a pretty intense word. Tell us about your sense that the SWERF TERF movement is a cult, because you were in that. Like, how did it seem like a cult to you?
I wouldn't say it's like a cult 100% the same way that like a cult would be with like a leader and a structure of power in that way, but the ways in which, you know, they utilize trauma, re-traumatize you, get you to trauma bond with these other people to create an in-group, the way that they use love bombing and like radical acceptance and like, oh, we're here for you, we care about you, we care about you, we care about you, that any time that like they disagree with you and it's taken away and someone's like, I remember there was this one point where I had run a fashion blog alongside my like, not like the same blog, but I like, you know, on Tumblr you can have multiple blogs. So I had my radical feminist blog where I was really, you know, like posting all my political views within like the SWERF and TERF movement. And I had this other blog where I would mostly post like fashion, because I find fashion history to be really interesting and like, I think it's really pretty and artistic. And I reblogged this photo of a trans woman in this like gorgeous dress, and like it was more about the dress for me than it was the trans woman, and it was just like a beautiful picture and a beautiful garment. And I remember like 2 or 3 other like SWERF and TERFs were like, why would you reblog that? Like that woman's like, or that man, you know, which like feels disgusting saying now because I like just regret so much the way that I thought about trans women at the time, but they were like, why would you, you know, reblog that picture of that man? You know, he's taking opportunities away from biological women to be in these fashion shows. And like in retrospect, it's like, it's a fucking dress. It's a fashion show. It's one trans person wearing a garment, just living their life, doing their job, you know? But it hurts so bad just to have like, to like just reblog this one thing, this very minor transgression, and have people be like, what the fuck, that's so fucked up, you know, after they've given me so much support, that you just kind of are like, oh, well, I guess I'll delete this post. I guess I was wrong, you know, like, and it's just really common, like stuff like that would happen. That's like one example, but it would just be like anytime you would like argue or whatever, it was like any argument against our ideology was taken as victim blaming, as invalidating our trauma. It's us against the world, you know, and like it's very much like that mentality. And it's the same sort of thing. I know at least one person who used to be involved in like the Nazi movement and has since like does a lot of anti-racist work and like is very you know, involved in like anti-racist causes. And it's the same sort of mentality where it's just kind of like, we're the only people that care about you, the whole world is against you, you know, which is why I strongly believe that the radical feminist movement more closely resembles a hate group than a progressive group or a group to, you know, advocate for the rights of anyone.
Okay, you know, I have an interview coming up, and I'm going to send her this video prior to our, like a day prior to our interview.
Ckiara has just reached out to Julie Bindel, who
God.
I mean, you know what? I think you're very courageous, Ckiara, because that's going to be an intense interview, and
yeah,
you know?
I'm doing my homework, so don't worry.
Hell yeah! I mean, the arguments are possible to deconstruct, and like, you know, if you do your research, you can get there. But it's God, like, they use so many like logical fallacies and try to get you tripped up, and like at the end of the day, oftentimes like if they can't explain anything, it's well, you're invalidating, and like
Politics.
good luck.
I mean, what I'm
Like,
hoping,
good luck.
what I'm hoping you can do, and I believe in you to do this, is to just be one counterexample. One, just of a sex worker, particularly a black sex worker, black indigenous sex worker who doesn't have a pimp, doesn't have a trafficker, does not feel victimized. You feel very much in the driver's seat of your choices around your career. If they could just see that there are people like that, and not dismiss you as they always say, like, well, okay, there's a few like that, but they're the privileged, white escorts who are getting $1,000 an hour kind of thing.
Yeah, I saw that a lot when I was doing the research with her and Catherine
McKinnon.
Yeah, and I'm gonna send her an email too.
Oh, wow. You're gutsy.
If you look at the study that they talk about when they say that voluntary sex workers are the minority, I wish I could link the study or like remember who did it, but where they get the like 80% myth from, where it's like 80% of women want out of sex work, is if you look at the questions they ask women, they're so guided. They're all like, oh, if you could get paid the exact same amount and work the same amount of hours in a different job, would you do that? And it's like, if you ask that to people working in bars, they would say yes. You know what I mean? Like,
but it's also this other thing with their research is that this is a billion-dollar business, more billions of dollar business, and that means that you got millions of clients, and you've got millions of customers, and you've got millions of you haven't really researched. Your research is a small research magnified. You haven't really spoken to each individual.
Yeah.
Where does your research come from?
I mean, also, if you look at the legal definition of trafficking, it's so vague and open-ended that, like, if you work with another sex worker, technically you're a trafficking victim. So
and a trafficker.
And a trafficker, yeah. Me and my friend talked about this when we did like a little tour dancing at different strip clubs, where we were kind of like, oh, like we could be arrested for trafficking each other since we're both doing sex work together and staying in the same hotel.
Exactly.
Yeah. Sasha, can I run by you my theory I've come to as why there's this correlation between the SWERF and the TERF, and see if that rings true for you?
Yes, I would love to hear it.
Because it really mystified me, because they don't seem like there's an intuitive connection at all. And then I saw on a Twitter debate somewhere, I saw a TERF call saying like, well, saying the typical thing, we don't want trans people in our dressing room, so-and-so, because, and this woman said, because a penis is a weapon of rape. A penis is a weapon of rape. And that clicked a light bulb off. And it's like, okay, if you view, obviously in some cases, penises, people with penises have raped, and you could see why one would think of that as a weapon of rape. But if you have a generalized view that a penis is a weapon of rape, then it would follow that that this industry that caters in large part to penises and their owners, sexual desire, and also that people with penises who identify as women, many trans women, are basically like all purveyors of this violent, penetrative weapon.
This monster.
Does that ring true for your experience, that might be a key to why there's this correlation?
I agree with you. I think that there is this idea, like if you really like whittle it down, when it comes to like the rad femme movement, identifying with trauma, it's kind of this idea where you feel very weak and you feel very vulnerable, and they kind of use these ideas to describe like all women. Like, we are vulnerable people who like are at a biological disadvantage that need to be protected at all times. And this trauma of like having been assaulted oftentimes like with a penis and identifying with that trauma creates this like us versus them mentality where it doesn't matter how the person with the penis identifies, which also like there are tons of trans women who like don't have penises too, you know? That like it creates this mentality where it's like there is something biological within assigned male at birth people that makes them evil, murdery rapists.
Yeah, it's called the mind.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's like
it's not their genital. It is their mind. It is the mind.
Yeah.
It's just like money. That's the thing. With money and sex, I hate it when they evilify money and they evilify sex. One can fly away if a little wind blows, and the other one, it's a biological function.
Yeah.
It's the mind.
Yeah. It's definitely like it's the person, and it's but it's this idea, it's so reductive, and it's so unforgiving of men, where it's like painting men as this like group of people that are like not worth saving. Don't even try to make them better. Don't try to hold them accountable as better people. But we as women need our safe spaces where we're protected from the big horrible penis that's like always looming around the corner waiting to get us. And it's kind of like, what a horrible world to live in, to imagine, you know, that there's always someone around the corner that you can't trust anybody from this group. And like I said earlier with like other hate groups, I feel like it's the same sort of mentality that like neo-Nazis have against people of color, where like all of them are evil people who will hurt you, and there's no point in like trying to make the world a better place or trying to understand their perspective, just, you know, like us versus them.
Yeah,
and it's
so
like,
that goes back to communication. That goes back to honest, pure communication.
Yeah.
And also I had I read something on Facebook where someone I knew was talking about, oh, men, they think that if you say yes, they understand it, that's it, that's all. I think that men aren't really, just like clients aren't given a chance. I don't think men try to say something and then we jump down their throat. I had that even in an interview where I had a male sex worker, and when I was watching it again, you know, I was looking at how myself and my non-binary guest wouldn't let him, when he started to say something that it wasn't even the whole sentence that we didn't agree with, we just jumped all over him. And you know, but I learned from that, and I'm like, wait a minute, I need to step back and be able to let this person express themselves the way they know how, because that's the only way they know how, and then correct them afterwards. Not, you know, jump all over them, you know.
Absolutely. I believe that patriarchal systems definitely exist, that there's a history of these power structures that oppress, you know, women, you know, and you know, specifically people who are assigned female at birth. But I think that a lot of those power structures have backfired back onto men in a way that we don't ever really acknowledge as much as we should. So like men also are hurt by patriarchy, and I don't necessarily like agree with the idea of quantifying like who has it worse, you know, like is it worse for women, is it worse for men? It's kind of like, why do we want to quantify suffering in the first place? Can we not acknowledge that this thing just hurts all of us and try and work on fixing those problems?
Exactly.
Sasha, I have one more question, and then maybe Ckiara, you have we should probably start winding down. But tell us a little bit about the later part of switching out, because you mentioned kind of the early parts. You working at IHOP, meeting different people. You met non-binary and trans friends. When did it tip and you're like, all right, I'm done with Swerf, I'm back on the...
I think when I returned to sex work, probably, because I got into this place where like I had kind of deconstructed all of my beliefs, and I had transitioned out of being, you know, a Swerf and TERF, and was kind of just like a more politically open and aware person, and like, you know, more willing to change my views should I find out that they're wrong. And it got to this point where like, or I got to a point in my life where I was, you know, in an apprenticeship to become a body piercer. some stuff happened. I ended up like, you know, leaving that, and I had this job at like a hair salon that just didn't work well. Like it wasn't a good fit. It was like worse than working at the tattoo shop and worse than like almost any job I'd ever had. And I got fired from this hair salon because like one of the other stylists didn't like me or something. And I was just like, well, I've always wanted to be a stripper, you know, like since I was younger, I would watch like Girls Next Door, and I would see these like beautiful, glamorous women. And during my swerve phase, like was like, oh, that was like the media indoctrinating me. But I was like, maybe, you know, like I need a job. I had this girl I went to high school with that I knew stripped, and we were friends on Facebook. And I was kind of like, hey, like, could I come in with you sometime? You know, like, how does that work? And she was like, yeah, like, you're hot. We'll just set it up. Like, you know, come on in. And I went, and I was just like, wow, I love this. And like prior to that, when I was working in the bar, there were like a couple people that had known me since I was like 18 that like would buy my videos and stuff. And I would occasionally make them, but I wasn't in it as a job. And so like returning to stripping was when I really like started understanding sex work from the perspective of in-person workers, which was something that I'd never experienced before. Because like prior to my swerve and turf phase, I had been a cam girl, and I had had a couple instances where I was like sugaring, like going on dates with people sort of platonically, but that was it. And so it was like this whole new world of sex work had been like opened up to me that I was understanding from a first person perspective. And from there, you know, like I got involved with you know, full service, like through like a friend. And, you know, now I just do the stripping and the camming and stuff, but like I kind of ran the gambit and experienced all aspects that this industry has to offer. And I realized so much more, and like from those experiences was like really, really understood how wrong I was, and like interacting with sex workers instead of straw manning them and propping them up as like, you know, like, oh, like they're solely their trauma, or they're these like faceless people that I never hear from their firsthand experience, you know. And from there I got into I just got really passionate, and I was like going to the sex worker outreach project like meetups and stuff, and like local like little sex worker groups where we would all hang out and talk to each other. And now, I mean, like not with the coronavirus pandemic, unfortunately, but we're on like a brief hold, but I volunteer once a week with my local sex workers outreach project. And like we're a pro decrim harm reduction based organization. So like our thing is like no judgment, no shame. You like you're in this industry, you know, whether by choice or coercion, you know, or force. We're here to make sure that like we're reducing as much harm as possible. So we provide condoms, we provide fentanyl test strips, safe drug use supplies. We have like food, we have like a little clothing drive, like any donations we give out to people. And we also have resources. So if people want to seek therapy or go to a, you know, gynecologist that they know isn't going to judge them for being a sex worker, that they can speak openly with, we have like a list of providers and stuff that they can go and see. And then we also have, you know, resources for like women's shelters or financial aid should they decide to leave and are having trouble with that. But it's all based on like you as a human being know what's best for you. You have the agency, you have the power, and we're just here to help you in any way that we can as part of the community.
Right, because that's the way things should be.
Yeah.
That is in reality, not just sex work, just in reality, a human right. It's an inalienable right. And we need to enforce that for people, not just in the sex work, but people to empower themselves, because we come from a long line of you know, being colonized, or even the colonizers were colonized. They were indentured slaves. And so that mentality continues. Yeah. And it continues not as a whole, as a human race. And we need to get away from quantifying suffering. We need to get away from trying to, you know, separate and segregate based on skin tones, because you don't ever know what another person is, because everyone's mixed. Do you understand what I'm saying? People identify differently with different things, and stop this and come as a whole. But you do know that those things are propagated and set forth in the media, like they were talking about COVID-19. all of a
Yeah.
sudden it's just the black and brown people that have it the most. It's always the black and brown people that have it the most. And, you know, it gets to the point where you're just like, really, are you serious? You know, get over it. Yeah, so I really wish that we could push this more in the sex industry, in this adult industry.
Yeah.
Because, to be honest with you, from my research, and I've been in this 30 years, and I've been in every aspect of it. I started stripping, and I know what you're talking about, because in stripping, I went, and I think I forgot what I did to my ankle, and then we went to the hospital. We went to the emergency, and then I told the doctor, because I've always been honest about myself. And I told him, no, I'm a stripper. This ass, oh, it was my knee. He looks at my knee and he says, you have gonorrhea. And I'm looking.
They do that.
Yes, he did.
I've
He looked at my knee. He says, it's gonorrhea. And I looked at him. I'm like 20 then. And I'm like, I said, you looking at my knee, you think I have gonorrhea by looking at my knee. I swear to you. And he didn't come back inside the into the room ever again. I had another instance when I was working in Nevada. I went to check it out and stuff with the brothel. Oh my God, never again. I hate that.
I've heard bad things from women I know who have gone there.
Oh my God,
too.
no, first of all, it's so degrading. They have these signs, right? These prostitutes are forced to, you know, wear this and that. And then when you go to the doctor to see the gynecologist, you know, I told her, I mean, they supplied me with the woman condom, and she says, you do not use that. Do you hear me? And I'm like, okay, see, who the fuck do you think you're, this is, you know, and that's when I had to leave, because I just felt like I was going to fight everything. Because no, they got on my nerves that much, and they don't understand that, you know, it's, you know, I'm not gonna sit down and lollipop and take whatever fuck you give me.
No.
I'll give it back.
I mean,
you know,
it's funny too, because they did a study in New Zealand since they've decriminalized sex work, and found that full service sex workers on average are 80% less likely to have an STI than the regular population.
Yeah.
right.
Because it's your job. Like,
It's your job.
And yeah, there's another study that's showing that a lot of HIV, new HIV cases are coming from actually younger people, but who aren't involved in the sex industry, and housewives.
They're not using condoms. They don't care. They like think that like STI stigma is a big part of this too, where it's like people think that STIs are only something that happens if you're like a drug user, or if you're a prostitute or something like that, when in reality it's like those diseases don't care what you do for a living or who you are. You know, if you're not protecting yourself, you're exposing yourself regardless.
Exactly. More sex education for everybody.
Yes. But yeah, I totally agree with you. And it's, I mean, that's why I really love harm reduction so much, is because it's like pretty bipartisan. It's not, you know, right or left. It's like, oh, like, let's just help people, give people the information that they need to make responsible decisions, and give them the tools to be as safe as possible, so that we can just reduce harm. And that goes with like, whether it's drug use, whether it's sex work, you know, whatever it is, like, you as a human being, if given the proper information, are capable of making decisions for yourself. Point blank. That's it. Just provide people with information and resources, and let them make choices, and they'll make the right ones. I don't know what's best for any other human being, and that was an important thing, I think, to let go of and to understand, you know?
Beautiful. Yeah, you can learn so much being in this industry. And I'm just gonna this is the last thing I'm gonna say. Sex workers and people in the industry, I notice, are a lot more artsy. They're a lot more opinionated, and they're a lot more willing to step outside the box. So I really hope that we get more and more empowered, especially those of us in the industry that aren't empowered, that really feel down and dirty about ourselves. Yeah, you sharing your story makes a big difference, because I know for a fact, when I was down and out, listening to other people, or even in those self-help groups with the exclusion of their anti-sex, it really helps. It helps to always have someone out there who may have some similarities to your stories, and are willing
Community
to
is so
share.
important. Yeah.
Yeah, because it does empower you and it lifts you up from wherever you are at. If it's a bad thing, you know. I thank you so much for this interview. You are intelligent, beautiful, bright, and
Thank you.
I want you
I
to.
just feel like it's my responsibility to like have participated in something so terrible. I should come out and explain, you know, why I was wrong and like, you know, use the things that I learned in that movement to better fight for, you know, the rights of other people and, you know, for their humanity.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for being here and for sharing and being vulnerable and sharing your whole, all the twists and turns of your amazing journey. And we wish you the best in all the work that you're doing. And thank you so much.
Yes, you are wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Please, will you come back and see us?
Absolutely, anytime.
Will. Okay.
Would it be cool if I plugged the donation link for the Sex Workers Outreach
Project?
Yeah,
please. Yeah.
The website for Sex Workers Outreach Project Chicago is swop-chicago.org. And we have a GoFundMe running right now to supply our red light van, which is a van we use for outreach to go to the local communities, often in areas with high population of outdoor sex workers, so that we can provide harm reduction supplies, resources, whatever they may need. And then my Twitter is twitter.com/XO Sasha Darling. My Instagram is also XO Sasha Darling. And my OnlyFans is onlyfans.com/Sasha Darling.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time and your story.
Thank you.
Great.
Bye.
Bye. Have a good one. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you guys for joining us for this week with Sasha Darling. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and follow. Thank you, and see you next week. Bye.